They were easily one of the most successful mafia families left in America until today.
They're saying you guys are big players in the Mafia. Is that true?
Your father is.
Go to youtube.com/alprofit, hit the join button, become a member, support content so I can get more political, and you're going to get to
the media that
others won't see, and I'm going to be uploading all the stuff I have on Amazon for you members to see too.
Feared by the average person and well-known, very imposing personal presence.
One major witness scheduled to be called next week is Detroit alleged underworld figure Anthony Giacalone. Robert Bennett for News 4 at the Federal Building in downtown Detroit.
The reputation of Anthony Giacalone was that he was a brilliant man who could have run one of the big three, that he was that smart.
The Giacalones have always been much more in the model of people who wanted to be perceived as being bad guys, tough guys, street guys.
And
Client pled the fifth or not, Mr. Early?
I can only assume he did. I advised him to do that. He was only in there a short minute or two, and he came out. I didn't ask him the question. I assume he did.
You have no idea what kind of question?
I doubt if it got past his name and address.
By the late 60s, Tony Giacalone and his brother Vito were firmly ensconced as the ruling mafia powers on the streets of Detroit, and they carried themselves that way, especially Tony Jack.
He attempted to be, and was for many people, an intimidating physical presence. He was tall, well-dressed, and he projected an aura of menace.
Well, he was very visible, and he was the person who people thought of when they thought of organized crime.
So he was a sort of a Hollywood version of a mobster, which is unusual in Detroit. He relished the image of being a well-dressed, frightening individual.
So Adler is running this gambling house for the Giacalones. It gets raided. I think there was speculation on the street that Adler hadn't paid the cops off or hadn't, done his due diligence to make sure that the place wasn't raided. And this upset the Giacalones.
Yes, that is true. And also, Adler was also caught using loaded dice in his games. That is a big no-no to use loaded dice in games.
And these were games that the actual mobsters showed up to gamble at. It wasn't always a situation where they were trying to scam, outsiders. They were actually, gambling themselves. So Adler was in turn trying to rip off his own bosses. So Adler ended up in the trunk of his car on around 10 in Greenfield, the Lincoln Center Shopping Plaza.
That is correct. He was found in the trunk of his car, strangled to death, in a very, very similar manner to the murder of Gus Andramas in 1947 and Jack George in 1950.
Harvey Leach, a prominent young businessman in Oakland County, came up missing after going to a meeting with Leonard Schultz, a man whose name would later come up in several other high-profile cases, including the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa.
Harvey Leach was a 35-year-old businessman from the area that owned Joshua Dorr Furniture, which eventually became Mr. Robinson's Furniture. And Joshua Dorr was allegedly started, according to FBI files, by startup money by the Giacalone brothers. Or Tony Giacalone had given possibly Harvey Leach money to start the business up and was acting as a silent partner.
Leach was on his way to see a man named Leonard Schultz, who is an associate of the Giacalone brothers.
The next time anyone saw him, Leach ended up in the trunk of a car.
That is correct. He was found the next day with his throat slit in the trunk of his car on the day he was supposed to be married.
Then there was the case of Saul Schindel, Jewish bookmaker that operated out of a popular downtown watering hole. They were black, but did most of their work for the Detroit Mafia back when men like the murderous Giacalone brothers, each suspected in double-digit homicides, still showed their faces on the streets of Detroit and helped flood it with heroin, among other things. Detroit's Murder Row Gang was a name not known to the average person, but was definitely known to the underworld elite of 1970s Motown.
When I arrived in Detroit, I saw some of the most dangerous persons that I ever thought existed. I saw a complete disregard for lawfulness, a kind of lawlessness that I never thought existed in any city. Not only was it a violent city, but it was a city that had a lot of corruption.
They haven't been active in nearly 40 years, but made a huge impact in the gangland heyday of the late 70s, building a mystique and mammoth reputation that still resonates on the streets of Detroit today. The gang was known for moving large quantities of heroin, doing contract hit work from coast to coast, and for the sheer volume of racketeers and cold-blooded killers in their midst. During the mid-70s, the Detroit Mafia, specifically the Giacalone brothers' crew, had in effect a black wing called Murder Row. The top dogs were Harold the Hawk Morton, Frank Nitti Usher, and Adolph Doc Holliday Powell, and they were helped by two of America's deadliest hitmen, Chester, the Grim Reaper, the Angel of Death Campbell, and James Red Freeman. Each of these guys had hits numbering in the high double digits. Some law enforcement estimate up to 100 murders committed by each of these guys. So there were two of the deadliest hitmen in the country, and their three bosses, Harold Morton, Frank Nitti, and Adolph Doc Holliday Powell, they were known to get their hands dirty too. So you had what was called Murder Row, because they were down to do what they had to do, and they were working with the Giacalone brothers, two guys who were some of the roughest mafioso in America of that era, and the two people that almost certainly orchestrated the kidnapping and death of Jimmy Hoffa. Frank Nitti, who had been Tony Giacalone's driver as a young man, had become the conduit of the Detroit Mafia family's heroin to the streets of Black Detroit. From the 1960s up until now, Detroit has the second highest rate of heroin addicts of any city in the country other than New York City. Now, if you only get your information from the newspapers, you would have thought that this heroin magically appeared in the hands of the black drug dealers. Growing up in Detroit in the 80s, of course, sensational stories about crime were flashed on the news, the newspapers, and it was almost always black faces, and you never heard about a Detroit Italian mafia. But the reality is they were behind the scenes. I wouldn't say pulling all the strings or controlling everything, but they certainly played a large hand in things. From the 1950s all the way through the 80s, a big portion of the heroin hitting the streets of Detroit was coming from the Italians. As an aside, in 1982, when the infamous YBI case was broken, there was a huge raid of Sylvester Seal Murray's posh Jeffersonian apartment on Detroit's riverfront, where several different big piles of money, $700,000 here, $500,000 there, were found in the apartment. And Sylvester Seal wouldn't say much about one particular pile of money other than that belongs to the Dagos, slang for Italians, and he wouldn't talk any more about it.
The reputation of Anthony Giacalone was that he was a brilliant man who could have run one of the big three, that he was that smart.
Feared by the average person and well known to the media. He had a very imposing personal presence. At that point, he was notorious for dressing in a very flashy style.
He was a man of very few words, but was someone with just the nod of his head could make things happen, such as people disappearing.
The Giacalones, Joseph Giacalone and Vito Giacalone, were in yesterday, but speculation as to when you might be calling Anthony Giacalone.
You're going to have to continue to speculate. I wish I could help you, but you know that I can.
Your client pled the fifth or not, Mr. Early?
I can only assume he did. I advised him to do that. He was only in there a short minute or two, and he came out. I didn't ask him the question. I assume he did.
You have no idea what kind of questions may have been put to him there?
I doubt if they got past his name and address.
Tony Giacalone that day shows up at the Southfield Athletic Club, spends the entire day at the Southfield Athletic Club. He was known by many people to be a very sort of surly, taciturn kind of guy, but he must have asked 50 people at the Southfield Athletic Club, they said, what time is it now? You got the time? You got the time?
Never talked to anybody they didn't need to talk to, especially didn't talk to regular civilians on a regular basis. He was going around shaking everyone's hand, asking people what time it was, how their day was going, to establish an alibi for himself. According to FBI surveillance records, Jack Tocco, the acting boss of the Detroit family at that time, came from Macomb County to Oakland County to meet with Giacalone. Giacalone and Tocco were not very close. They did not meet face-to-face very often. The fact that Tocco was coming to Oakland County, coming to South Athletic Club that afternoon, really told the FBI and investigators that something very important had just happened.